I overheard my partner tell her friends she settled for me financially, then asked why I looked hurt. The lawyer's paralegal handed me the bank statements at 3:14 p.m. on a Thursday, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking as I counted the transfers. 53 separate withdrawals over 18 months, $127,000 total. My fiancée Natasha had been systematically draining our joint accounts while telling me we needed to cut back on groceries. The paralegal, a woman named Diane Fisher with 22 years in family law, watched me read through the documents with the kind of patient expression that told me she'd seen this exact scenario play out dozens of times before. She slid a box of tissues across the conference table without saying a word. I didn't cry. I just sat there staring at the highlighted rows in the spreadsheet, each one representing another piece of the life I thought we were building together, and tried to remember when I'd stopped being a person to her and started being a resource. It had started 6 days earlier with a bathroom door that wouldn't quite close. I'd come home early from my accounting job at the firm because of a migraine that felt like someone was driving an ice pick through my left temple. The apartment was supposed to be empty. Natasha had texted me that morning saying she was spending the afternoon at her friend Kimberly's place across town. I'd taken 2 Excedrin and gone to lie down, but the sound of voices from the living room pulled me back out of bed. I recognized Natasha's laugh immediately, that bright, performative sound she made when she was trying to charm someone. I walked toward the living room, planning to say hello, but something in the tone of the conversation made me stop just outside the doorway. The bathroom door next to where I stood was open about 6 inches, giving me a clear view through to the living room mirror. I could see Natasha on the couch with 3 women I'd met before at various gatherings. Kimberly was there, along with her sister Veronica and their friend Autumn. Autumn was asking Natasha about our wedding plans, and Natasha's response made my stomach drop. She said, "Honestly, I'm just relieved to have it locked down. Do you know how hard it is to find a guy with a stable income and good credit these days?" Kimberly laughed and made some comment about Natasha always being practical. Then Natasha continued, her voice taking on this conspiratorial tone that I'd never heard her use before. "I mean, Jeffrey's not exactly what I pictured when I was younger, you know? I always thought I'd end up with someone more ambitious, someone with that drive to really make something of themselves. But at 32, you start getting realistic about what's actually available." She paused, and I watched her take a sip of wine in the mirror's reflection. "He's stable, he's predictable, he makes decent money, and he's so grateful that someone like me is interested in him that he doesn't ask too many questions. It's actually pretty ideal when you think about it practically." The other women made various sounds of agreement and amusement. Veronica said something about how Natasha had always been the smart one, thinking with her head instead of her heart. Natasha laughed again, that same bright sound, and said, "I learned my lesson with guys like Victor. The hot ones are never worth the drama. Give me boring and stable over exciting and broke any day." I stood there in the hallway, my migraine completely forgotten, watching my fiancé see. He described me like I was a used car she'd settled for after her first choice fell through. The casual cruelty of it was almost impressive. Not exactly what I pictured. So grateful that someone like me is interested in him. Boring and stable. Each phrase landed like a physical blow, and I found myself cataloging them in my mind, wondering how long she'd felt this way and how I'd been stupid enough not to notice. I must have made some sound, or maybe I shifted my weight and the floorboard creaked, because suddenly Natasha's head snapped toward the hallway. Our eyes met in the mirror, and I watched her face go through this rapid sequence of expressions. Surprise, then calculation, then something that looked almost like annoyance. She stood up quickly and came into the hallway, her voice immediately shifting to that sweet, concerned tone she used when she wanted something from me. "Jeffrey, I didn't know you were home. Are you feeling okay? You look upset." I stared at her, this woman I'd been planning to marry in 4 months, this woman I'd been sharing my life with for 3 years, and I couldn't find words. She actually looked confused by my expression, like she genuinely couldn't understand why overhearing her describe me as a boring consolation prize might have hurt my feelings. She reached out to touch my arm, and I stepped back instinctively. Her confusion deepened. "What's wrong? Did something happen at work?" I finally found my voice. "I heard what you said, about settling for me, about me being boring and stable instead of what you actually wanted." Natasha's face did something complicated. Her eyes widened slightly, and her mouth formed this little O of surprise. But underneath that, I could see her mind working, calculating how to handle this. She glanced back toward the living room where her friends had gone silent, clearly listening to every word. Then she looked back at me and actually laughed, a small, dismissive sound. "Jeffrey, you're being ridiculous. You took that completely out of context. We were just having girl talk, being silly." She stepped closer again, reaching for my hand. "You know I love you. Why are you being so sensitive about this?" The word sensitive landed like she meant it to, like she was pointing out a character flaw instead of responding to legitimate hurt. I pulled my hand away. "You said I'm not what you pictured, that you settled because you got realistic about what's available, that I'm grateful someone like you is interested in me." I heard my voice getting louder, but I couldn't stop it. "How exactly is that out of context, Natasha?" Her friends had appeared in the living room doorway now, watching the scene with varying expressions of discomfort and curiosity. Natasha's cheeks flushed, but I couldn't tell if it was embarrassment or anger. You're making a scene, she hissed, her voice dropping low. We'll talk about this later when you've calmed down and can have a rational conversation. She turned to her friends with an apologetic smile. I'm so sorry, everyone. Jeffrey's not feeling well. He gets these migraines that make him irrational sometimes. The casual lie, the smooth way she turned it around to make me the problem, made something snap inside my chest. I looked at Kimberly, Veronica, and Autumn standing there in my living room, in my apartment that I paid 80% of the rent for, and I said very clearly, she just told you all that I'm boring and she settled for me because she couldn't do better. And now she's acting confused about why that might hurt my feelings. Does that seem irrational to anyone else? Veronica had the grace to look uncomfortable. Autumn studied her shoes. Kimberly opened her mouth like she might say something, then closed it again. Natasha's expression hardened into something I'd never seen before, something cold and assessing. I think you need to go cool off somewhere, Jeffrey. You're embarrassing yourself. That's what she said. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I didn't mean it that way. Not, let's talk about this. Just that I was embarrassing myself by having feelings about being described as a fallback option. I grabbed my wallet and keys from the counter and left. I drove around for 2 hours, my migraine pounding behind my eyes, trying to process what I'd heard and how Natasha had reacted when confronted. What bothered me most wasn't even the words themselves, though those stung badly enough. It was the calculation in her eyes when she'd seen me in the hallway, the immediate pivot to making me the problem, the absolute lack of apology or acknowledgement that maybe, possibly, what she'd said was hurtful. I kept thinking about that phrase, so grateful that someone like me is interested in him. Like she'd been managing me this whole time, keeping me grateful and compliant. When I finally went back to the apartment, it was after 10 p.m., and Natasha was in bed, pretending to be asleep. I slept on the couch that night, my first time doing that in 3 years. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. She made coffee and asked about my day, and mentioned something about needing to finalize the wedding venue deposit. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. I brought it up again, trying to stay calm, and she sighed this long-suffering sigh and said, Jeffrey, I already told you that you misunderstood. I was just venting with my friends. Everyone complains about their partners sometimes. It doesn't mean anything. I pointed out that she didn't complain about me. She described settling for me, and she rolled her eyes. You're being dramatic. This is exactly what I meant about being sensitive. That word again. Sensitive. Like having emotions was a personal failing. She left for work before I could respond, calling over her shoulder that she'd be late because she had dinner plans with colleagues. I went to work in a daze and spent most of the day staring at spreadsheets without actually processing any of the numbers. My office mate, David Cho, asked if I was okay, and I found myself telling him everything. David listened with this increasingly troubled expression, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that stuck with me. Man, that's not just mean. That's strategic mean. Like she was establishing with her friends that you're the disposable one in the relationship. I'd been thinking of Natasha's comments as cruel but impulsive. David's framing made me reconsider. Strategic. Establishing that I was grateful and boring and lucky to have her. Why would someone need to establish that narrative unless they were planning something? I spent the rest of the day turning that question over in my mind. When I got home that evening, Natasha was already there, cooking dinner like everything was normal. She'd made my favorite pasta dish and opened a bottle of wine. The message was clear. We were moving past this, and I was expected to get with the program. I didn't touch the wine. Instead, I asked her a direct question. Do you actually love me, or am I just convenient? Natasha set down the wooden spoon she'd been using and turned to face me with this expression of exaggerated patience. Jeffrey, you're really going to keep doing this? I've tried to be understanding about your overreaction, but this is getting exhausting. I said I'm sorry if your feelings were hurt. I noted that she actually hadn't said that before, and even now it was sorry if, not sorry that. She continued. But you need to let this go. We have a wedding to plan. We have a life to build. Are you really going to throw all of that away because you got your feelings hurt during some private girl talk that you weren't supposed to hear anyway? The framing was masterful. She'd managed to make the problem both my eavesdropping and my emotional reaction rather than the actual content of what she'd said. And that last phrase, that you weren't supposed to hear anyway, implied that she'd been managing what I knew about her real feelings all along. I realized in that moment that I didn't actually know this person. 3 years together, engaged for 6 months, living together for 14 months, and I couldn't tell you what she really thought about me. Everything suddenly felt suspect. Every compliment might be manipulation. Every moment of affection might be performance. I looked at her standing there in our kitchen, beautiful and composed and utterly unrepentant, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. I told her I needed some time to think. She said I was being ridiculous and immature. I packed a bag anyway and went to stay at my brother Leo's apartment across town. Leo took one look at my face and pulled out the couch bed without asking questions. Later that night, after I'd told him everything, he said, You need to protect yourself, man. If she talks about you like that to her friends, what else is she hiding? I told him he was being paranoid. He suggested I check our joint bank account just to be sure. I logged into the account on my laptop at 1:33 a.m., unable to sleep on Leo's lumpy couch. My stomach dropped when I saw the balance. We'd had almost $45,000 saved 6 months ago. Now there was $12,000. I started going through the transaction history with shaking hands. Transfers to an account I didn't recognize. Cash withdrawals in amounts just under $500, small enough not to trigger automatic alerts. Payments to businesses I'd never heard of. I made a spreadsheet, something I was good at from my job, and started categorizing every suspicious transaction. By the time the sun came up, I'd identified over $30,000 in transfers and withdrawals I couldn't account for. When I called Natasha, my voice was remarkably steady. "Where's the money from our savings account?" There was a long pause. Then she said, "What are you talking about?" I read her 3 of the transaction dates and amounts. Another pause, longer this time. "Those are wedding expenses. Did you forget we're planning a wedding? This is exactly why I handle the finances, Jeffrey. You don't pay attention to anything." But I'd been tracking our wedding budget in a separate spreadsheet, something I'd set up months ago because I liked having clear numbers. The deposits to vendors, the dress, the venue, all of that was accounted for and totaled maybe $18,000. I told her this. She got irritated, that edge creeping into her voice that appeared whenever I pushed back on something. "I don't have time for this right now, Jeffrey. I'm at work. We'll discuss it when you stop acting crazy and come home." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there on Leo's couch with my laptop, looking at the spreadsheet of transactions, and David's words echoed in my head. Strategic mean. I called my bank and asked for a full accounting of all transactions on our joint account for the past 2 years. The customer service representative, a woman named Patricia Simmons, who identified herself as a senior account specialist with 15 years of experience, told me that would take 3 to 5 business days to compile. I said that was fine and gave her my email address. Leo came home that evening with takeout and found me still on the couch, still staring at numbers on my laptop. He sat down next to me and looked at the screen. "Holy shit," he said quietly. "That's a lot of money." I told him about the phone call with Natasha, how she'd dismissed my concerns and refused to explain the transactions. Leo was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know what you need? A lawyer." I started to protest that we weren't married yet, that this was probably just a misunderstanding, but Leo cut me off. "Jeffrey, she's taken $30,000 from your shared account and won't tell you where it went. That's not a misunderstanding. That's theft." The word hit me hard. Theft. I'd been thinking of it as financial confusion, maybe poor communication about expenses. But Leo was right. If someone took money that belonged to both of us and refused to account for it, that was theft. He pulled up his phone and texted someone, then showed me the response. His friend Dennis Kowalski was a family law attorney who did free consultations. Leo had already sent him a brief overview of my situation. Dennis had responded, "Free lunch tomorrow? This sounds messy." I met Dennis at a cafe near his office the next day. He was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with the kind of sharp-eyed attention that made me understand why Leo trusted him. I walked him through everything: the overheard conversation, Natasha's reaction, the missing money, her refusal to explain. Dennis took notes in a leather-bound notebook and asked occasional clarifying questions. When I finished, he sat back and studied me for a long moment. "Jeffrey, I'm going to be straight with you. This sounds like financial abuse. The pattern is textbook. Isolate the resources, control the narrative, make the victim doubt their own perceptions." I started to object that Natasha wasn't abusive, that she'd never hit me or anything like that, and Dennis held up a hand. Abuse isn't just physical. Financial abuse is using money to control or manipulate someone. Emotional abuse is using psychological tactics to make someone question their reality. From what you've described, your fiancée is doing both. He flipped back through his notes. She positioned you as the grateful, lesser partner in front of her friends, establishing that you're lucky to have her rather than the other way around. When you confronted her, she made you the problem instead of addressing your legitimate concerns. She's taken significant money from a joint account and refuses to explain where it went. She's dismissing your attempts to get answers as you being sensitive or crazy. These are control tactics, Jeffrey. And in my experience, people don't use control tactics unless they're hiding something or planning something. I felt sick. Dennis continued. The fact that she's systematically withdrawing money but keeping the amount small enough to avoid automatic alerts suggests planning and intent. This isn't impulsive spending. This is deliberate financial manipulation. He slid a business card across the table. "I want you to contact this person. She's a forensic accountant named Renata Phelps, 23 years in financial investigation. If there's money being hidden or diverted, she'll find it. And then we'll know exactly what we're dealing with." I took the card but didn't commit to calling. It still felt like an overreaction. Dennis seemed to read my hesitation. "Look, I get it. You love her. You want to believe there's an innocent explanation. But answer me this. Has she given you any explanation at all? Has she offered to show you receipts or documentation for where that money went?" I had to admit she hadn't. She'd just gotten angry and dismissive. Dennis nodded. "That's your answer right there. Someone with nothing to hide doesn't respond to financial questions with anger. They respond with transparency." He paid for lunch despite my protests and told me to call him when I was ready to move forward. As I walked back to Leo's apartment, I kept turning over what Dennis had said. Financial abuse, emotional abuse, control tactics. The words felt too big, too serious for what I was experiencing. Natasha was just defensive and bad with money, right? But then I remembered her face in the hallway mirror, that calculation in her eyes, and I wasn't so sure anymore. The bank records arrived 3 days later. I opened the email on a Saturday morning while Leo was at the gym. The PDF was 89 pages long. I started reading at page 1 and didn't stop until I'd gone through every transaction. By page 30, I felt nauseous. By page 60, I was angry. By page 89, I was calling Renata Phelps. She answered on the second ring and listened to my stammering explanation of who I was and why Dennis Kowalski had referred me. She stopped me halfway through and said, "Send me everything you have. Bank statements, transaction records, any documentation related to joint finances or assets. I'll review it and call you Monday with an initial assessment." Her voice was calm and professional, the kind of tone that suggested she'd seen situations like mine 100 times before. I sent her the files and spent the rest of the weekend in a fog, unable to concentrate on anything. Leo tried to distract me with a movie and takeout, but I barely registered either. Natasha had called me 6 times and sent 14 texts, progressing from concerned to angry to threatening. The latest one read, "If you don't come home and stop this childish tantrum, I'm going to reconsider whether this relationship is worth my time." The irony of that text, given what I knew about her actual feelings, would have been funny if it wasn't so devastating. Monday morning, Renata called at 9:15 a.m. Her first words were, "How much do you know about your fiancé C's financial history?" I admitted I knew very little. We'd never really discussed it in detail. Natasha had always said she was terrible with money, that she'd made some bad decisions when she was younger, and she seemed relieved when I'd offered to handle most of our joint finances. Renata made a humming sound. "That's interesting, because according to the patterns in these transactions, whoever's managing this account is actually quite sophisticated about financial manipulation." She walked me through what she'd found. The transactions I'd noticed were just the surface. Beneath those were dozens of smaller transfers, typically on Fridays when I was less likely to check the account immediately. There were recurring payments to something called Riverstone Holdings that totaled $28,000 over 18 months. There were cash deposits from unknown sources followed immediately by transfers out to different accounts. Renata's voice took on a harder edge. "Jeffrey, this account is being used to launder money. I can't tell you the source of the incoming deposits without more investigation, but the pattern is unmistakable. Money comes in, gets moved around through several transfers, then goes out in a way that's difficult to trace. Whoever set this up knew what they were doing." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Laundering money? That was criminal. That was federal crime level serious. I asked Renata what I should do. She said, "First, you document everything. Second, you remove your name from that joint account immediately. Third, you make copies of all financial records before your fiancé realizes you're on to her and tries to destroy evidence. Fourth, you hire Dennis Kowalski and do exactly what he tells you." Her tone softened slightly. "I know this is overwhelming, but Jeffrey, you're potentially liable for whatever's happening with that account. If federal investigators get involved, having your name on those transactions could destroy your life. You need to protect yourself, and you need to do it now." I called Dennis from the parking lot of my office building, where I'd been sitting in my car for the past 20 minutes trying to process Renata's words. He answered immediately and listened as I repeated everything she'd told me. When I finished, he was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "Can you take the afternoon off work? I want you to come to my office right now. We need to move quickly on this." I called in sick and drove to his office in downtown Portland. The receptionist showed me directly to a conference room where Dennis was waiting with another woman he introduced as Diane Fisher, one of his paralegals. Diane had that same calm, professional demeanor as Renata, and I found something oddly comforting about being in a room with people who seemed to understand the seriousness of what I was dealing with. Dennis slid a document across the table. "This removes your name from the joint account effective immediately. Sign it, I'll file it today, and you'll be legally separated from whatever Natasha is doing with that money." I signed with shaking hands. The next hour was a blur of paperwork and questions. Dennis asked me to document everything. When we'd opened the joint account, how much money I'd contributed versus Natasha, what I knew about her employment and income, whether I'd ever signed anything without reading it thoroughly. That last question made me pause. There had been a refinancing document 6 months ago that Natasha had asked me to sign. She'd said it was to get us a better interest rate on the savings account. I'd trusted her and signed it without reading the fine print. Dennis and Diane exchanged a look. "Do you have a copy of that document?" Dennis asked. I didn't. I'd never thought to ask for one. Diane made a note and said she'd request it from the bank. As we wrapped up, Dennis laid out the next steps. "We're going to get copies of everything financial you've ever shared with Natasha. We're going to have Renata do a full forensic analysis. We're going to protect your assets and your credit. And then we're going to figure out exactly what your fiancé has been doing with your money." I left the law office feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. My phone showed 9 missed calls from Natasha and a text that said simply, "We need to talk. Now." I didn't respond. Instead, I went back to Leo's apartment and found him sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open. He looked up when I came in, and his expression told me something had happened. "What is it?" I asked. Leo turned his laptop around so I could see the screen. It was a public records database, showing marriage certificates. Natasha's name appeared twice. She'd been married at 23 to someone named Richard Thornton. That marriage had ended in divorce 2 years later. Then she'd married again at 27 to someone named Alexander Yang. That marriage had ended after 18 months. I'd known Natasha had been married once before. She'd mentioned an ex-husband named Alex, who she described as controlling and financially irresponsible. She'd never mentioned Richard. She'd never mentioned being married twice. She'd never mentioned divorcing 2 different men before the age of 30. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. Leo pulled up more records. Both divorces had been messy. In the first one, Richard Thornton had filed a restraining order, though the details were sealed. In the second one, there had been allegations of financial fraud that were ultimately dismissed. "Jeffrey," Leo said carefully, "I think your fiancée has a pattern, and I don't think you're the first guy she's done this to." I sat down heavily in the nearest chair, my mind racing. 2 previous marriages, 2 divorces, allegations of financial fraud, a restraining order. None of this matched the story Natasha had told me about her past. She'd described herself as someone who'd made poor choices in partners, who'd learned from her mistakes, and was finally ready for a stable, healthy relationship. She'd positioned herself as the victim of bad men. But looking at these records, a different picture emerged. A pattern of finding men, marrying them quickly, accessing their finances, and then disappearing when the relationships fell apart. And I was apparently next in line. I spent the next 2 days digging. Leo helped me search public records while Diane worked on getting financial documents through official channels. Renata was conducting her forensic analysis. Dennis was building what he called a protective legal strategy. I felt like I was watching my life disassemble in real time, every assumption I'd made about Natasha and our relationship being systematically dismantled by evidence. On the 3rd day, Diane called me. "We've got the refinancing document you signed. Jeffrey, you need to come look at this." I drove to Dennis's office and found him and Diane waiting in the conference room with several documents spread across the table. The refinancing paperwork I'd signed 6 months ago wasn't for a better interest rate. It had transferred ownership of our joint account to Natasha's sole control while leaving my name on it for liability purposes. I'd essentially signed away my access to the money while remaining responsible for anything that happened with the account. Dennis pointed to the signature line. "This is extremely sophisticated fraud, Jeffrey. She had you sign a document that looked like standard banking paperwork, but actually changed the fundamental ownership structure of the account. You became a liable party without any control or access." I felt sick. How had I been so stupid? Dennis seemed to read my thoughts. "Don't blame yourself. This is professionally executed fraud. The document is designed to look legitimate. Most people wouldn't catch the discrepancy without legal training." Diane had more bad news. The account I'd noticed the transfers going to, the one I didn't recognize, was owned by Riverstone Holdings, a shell company registered in Delaware. The beneficial owner of that company was listed as Natasha Kramer. She'd been systematically transferring money from our joint account to her private company, money that I couldn't touch, but was legally responsible for. "How much total?" I asked, dreading the answer. Diane consulted her notes. "Based on Renata's analysis, approximately $127,000 over 18 months. That includes your contributions, joint savings, and money you didn't know about that was being moved through the account." The number hit me like a physical blow. $127,000, more than 2 years of my salary. Gone. Moved into accounts I couldn't access through a document I'd been tricked into signing. Dennis leaned forward. "Jeffrey, I need you to listen to me carefully. What Natasha has done is criminal fraud. We have documentation, we have evidence, and we have a clear pattern of intent. But here's the thing. If we're going to pursue criminal charges, you need to be prepared for this to get ugly. She's going to fight back. She's going to try to make you look bad. And based on her history, she's good at it." I thought about Richard Thornton's restraining order. I thought about the fraud allegations in Alexander Yang's divorce. I thought about how Natasha had described me to her friends as grateful and boring, establishing a narrative where I was the disposable one. Dennis was right. She'd been preparing for this confrontation from the beginning. Every conversation, every interaction, every financial move had been strategic. I'd been in a relationship with someone who was running a long-term con, and I'd been too trusting to see it. "What do we do?" I asked. Dennis pulled out a yellow legal pad and started making notes. "First, we file a police report. This is financial fraud, identity fraud, and theft. We want it on record with law enforcement. Second, we freeze all joint assets and credit. Diane's already started that process, but we need to be thorough. Third, we secure all documentation, every text, every email, every financial record. Fourth, we prepare for her response. She's going to come at you hard when she realizes the walls are closing in. We need you ready." That night, I filed a police report with Detective James Whitmore, a financial crimes investigator with 12 years on the force. He listened to my story with the kind of professional detachment that made me understand this wasn't unique or unusual to him. He asked for documentation, which I provided through Dennis. He asked about Natasha's behavior, her patterns, her previous relationships. He took notes in a worn leather notebook and occasionally nodded like something I said confirmed something he already suspected. At the end of the interview, Detective Whitmore closed his notebook and looked at me directly. "Mr. Lawson, I want you to understand what you're about to go through. Mrs. Kramer is going to deny everything. She's going to claim you're the one who took the money. She's going to say you're retaliating because she broke up with you. She's going to paint herself as the victim and you as the abuser. We see this pattern all the time with financial predators. They're very good at flipping the script." I asked how we combat that. He said, "Evidence, documentation, pattern history. We've got her 2 previous divorces with similar allegations. We've got financial records showing systematic transfers to accounts in her control. We've got that refinancing document she had you sign. We've got her company records showing she was funneling money through a shell corporation. That's a strong case, Mr. Lawson, but you need to be prepared for her to fight dirty." He was right. The next day, Natasha showed up at my office. She'd somehow found out where I was working. I'd been staying at Leo's and avoiding our apartment. She walked in during my lunch break and caused a scene in the lobby. She was crying, telling everyone who would listen that I'd stolen money from our joint account and abandoned her without explanation. That I'd been emotionally abusive throughout our relationship. That she was terrified of what I might do next. My boss, William Hutchinson, came down to see what the commotion was about. Natasha immediately shifted her performance to him, tears streaming down her face, explaining that I was her fiancé and I'd taken all their savings and disappeared. She was shaking, her voice breaking at exactly the right moments, and I watched William's expression shift from confusion to concern to something that looked almost like suspicion as he glanced at me. I stood there, frozen, watching Natasha execute exactly the strategy Detective Whitmore had warned me about. She was positioning herself as the victim. She was making me the villain, and she was doing it in front of my employer and colleagues, people whose good opinion mattered for my career. William asked if we could talk in his office. I said yes, but I needed to make a phone call first. I called Dennis, explained what was happening, and he told me not to say anything until he got there. He arrived 15 minutes later, introduced himself as my attorney, and the situation shifted immediately. Dennis handed William a folder containing the police report, the documentation of fraud, and a cease and desist letter directed at Natasha. "Ms. Kramer is under investigation for financial fraud. Mr. Lawson has been advised not to speak with her while that investigation is ongoing. Her appearance here constitutes harassment, and we have documented it accordingly." William read through the folder with widening eyes. Natasha's tears had stopped. She was staring at Dennis with an expression I'd never seen before, something cold and calculating and absolutely furious. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice steady now. "Jeffrey is trying to frame me because I broke up with him. None of this is real." Dennis didn't rise to the bait. He simply said, "That's what the police investigation will determine. In the meantime, Ms. Kramer, you're being asked to leave this private business. If you refuse, Mr. Hutchinson will call security and have you escorted out. If you return, you'll be arrested for trespassing." Natasha looked at me, and in that moment, I saw something I'd never seen in her face before. Genuine uncertainty. She'd expected me to fold under pressure, to defend myself emotionally, to engage with her drama. Instead, I'd brought a lawyer and documentation. Her script wasn't working. She left without another word, and William apologized for the disruption. Dennis gave him a brief overview of the situation, enough to explain that I was the victim of financial fraud, not the perpetrator, and William seemed satisfied. After Dennis left, William called me into his office privately and asked if I needed any time off to deal with the situation. I thanked him, but said I preferred to keep working, to maintain some normalcy. He nodded and told me to let him know if that changed. As I walked back to my desk, I felt something shift in my chest. For the first time since this nightmare started, I wasn't reacting defensively to Natasha's tactics. I was proactive. I was protected. I had evidence and documentation and professionals who believed me. I wasn't the grateful, boring, disposable partner she'd described to her friends. I was someone fighting back with truth and law on my side. It felt powerful in a way I hadn't expected. The investigation moved forward over the next 2 weeks. Detective Whitmore and his team traced the money from our joint account through Riverstone Holdings to a series of other accounts, some in Natasha's name and some belonging to people I'd never heard of. Renata identified a pattern that suggested Natasha wasn't working alone. The shell company structure and the movement of funds indicated knowledge and assistance from someone with financial expertise. Detective Whitmore brought in a forensic computer specialist named Dr. Yolanda Price, who had a PhD in digital forensics and 20 years of experience. Dr. Price analyzed Natasha's digital footprint and found communications with someone named Vincent Thornton, the same last name as Natasha's first husband, Richard. It turned out Vincent was Richard's brother, a financial advisor who'd been disbarred 3 years ago for helping clients hide assets during divorce proceedings. The pieces were coming together. Natasha and Vincent had apparently developed this scheme during or after her first marriage, then refined it through her second marriage, and were now running it on me. Dennis filed paperwork to freeze Natasha's access to Riverstone Holdings pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. The court granted the freeze, and suddenly Natasha couldn't access the money she'd stolen. I got a series of text messages from her, that progression from angry to desperate to threatening. You're going to regret this. I'll destroy you in court. No one will believe anything you say. I have evidence that you're the one who stole the money. Each message was screenshot and forwarded to Detective Whitmore, adding to the documentation of her behavior. Dennis advised me not to respond, and I didn't. The silence apparently drove her crazy, because she started calling from different numbers, her friends' phones, disposable cells, blocked numbers. I didn't answer any of them. Every call, every voicemail, every text was documented and forwarded to the detective. We were building an irrefutable case, one piece of evidence at a time. 3 weeks after I'd overheard that conversation in the bathroom hallway, Detective Whitmore called me in for an update. He'd arrested Vincent Thornton on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, and Vincent had started cooperating in exchange for a reduced sentence. What he told them was stunning. Natasha and Vincent had been running this con for 6 years. They'd identify targets, usually men with stable incomes, good credit, and trusting personalities. Natasha would start a relationship, move quickly toward commitment, gain access to finances, and then systematically drain accounts while Vincent helped move the money through shell corporations. They'd done it to Richard Thornton, though he'd caught on early enough that they'd only gotten about $30,000. They'd done it to Alexander Yang and taken him for $95,000 before he'd caught on and filed for divorce. The fraud allegations in his divorce had been true, but Natasha and Vincent had managed to make the evidence disappear by the time it went to court. I was the third mark, and they'd refined their approach with each iteration. Detective Whitmore showed me transcripts of text messages between Natasha and Vincent. They were cold and calculating, discussing me like I was a target rather than a person. Jeffrey's perfect, Natasha had written. Super trusting, makes good money, doesn't ask questions. I can probably get $150,000 out of him before he notices anything's wrong. Vincent had responded, make sure you do the emotional groundwork. These guys fold faster when they think they're lucky to have you. The emotional groundwork. That explained the early days of our relationship, when Natasha had been attentive and affectionate and seemingly perfect. That explained why she'd positioned herself as someone who'd been hurt before and was taking a chance on me. That explained the grateful narrative she'd established with her friends. All of it was strategic, designed to make me compliant and unquestioning while she systematically robbed me. I sat in Detective Whitmore's office, reading those messages, and felt something fundamental die inside me. Every moment of what I'd thought was our relationship had been a lie. The detective gave me time to process, then continued. Based on Vincent's cooperation and the documentation we'd provided, they had enough evidence to arrest Natasha on multiple felony charges: identity fraud, financial fraud, theft, conspiracy to commit fraud, and money laundering. The district attorney, a woman named Rebecca Cross with 16 years of prosecutorial experience, was personally handling the case because it demonstrated a pattern of predatory behavior. She wanted to make sure Natasha and anyone like her understood that this kind of calculated long-term fraud would be prosecuted aggressively. Detective Whitmore asked if I'd be willing to testify when the case went to trial. I said, absolutely. He nodded approvingly and told me they'd be arresting Natasha within the week. That evening, I sat in Leo's living room and told him everything Detective Whitmore had shared. Leo listened with an expression that cycled through anger, disgust, and something that looked almost like grief. When I finished, he said, I'm so sorry, Jeffrey. You didn't deserve any of this. I appreciated his support, but what struck me most was how methodical the whole thing had been. Natasha hadn't been a person who made bad choices or had flaws I could have overlooked. She'd been a professional criminal running a long-term con, and I'd been selected because I fit a specific profile. They arrested Natasha on a Thursday morning at her office. I wasn't there, but Dennis called me with the details. She'd been escorted out in handcuffs in front of her colleagues and clients. The local news picked up the story because of the pattern of fraud across multiple victims. The headline read, Local woman arrested for multi-year financial fraud scheme targeting partners. The article detailed the allegations, the previous victims, and the arrest of Vincent Thornton. Natasha's photo appeared next to Vincent's, both of them in booking photos. My name wasn't mentioned in the article, though the story referenced multiple victims over a 6-year period. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I mostly felt exhausted. The arraignment happened 3 days later. Natasha pleaded not guilty, which wasn't surprising. Her public defender, she couldn't afford a private attorney since all her accounts had been frozen, argued that she was the victim of false allegations from vindictive ex-partners. Rebecca Cross presented the evidence methodically: the banking records, the shell company documents, Vincent Thornton's testimony, the pattern across multiple relationships, the text messages between Natasha and Vincent discussing their targets. The judge, Honorable David Nakamura, reviewed the evidence with an expression that grew increasingly stern. When the prosecutor finished, Judge Nakamura denied bail. Ms. Kramer, the pattern of behavior documented here suggests a serious flight risk. You've demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of financial systems and a willingness to deceive people who trusted you. I'm not convinced that releasing you pending trial serves the interests of justice or public safety. Natasha's face went pale. Her attorney objected, arguing that she had ties to the community and no previous criminal record. Judge Nakamura wasn't swayed. The evidence suggests Ms. Kramer has been committing financial fraud for 6 years without being caught. The absence of a criminal record simply means she hasn't been prosecuted before, not that she hasn't committed crimes. Bail is denied. I watched from the gallery as they led Natasha away. She looked back over her shoulder, and our eyes met for just a second. There was no calculation there now, no strategic performance, just rage and something that might have been disbelief that her carefully constructed system had fallen apart. The trial was scheduled for 8 weeks later, but it never made it that far. Vincent Thornton's cooperation had given prosecutors everything they needed, and Natasha's attorney advised her to take a plea deal. Rebecca Cross offered 7 years in state prison plus full restitution to all victims and a permanent prohibition from working in any financial capacity. Natasha's attorney tried to negotiate down to 5 years, but Cross wouldn't budge. The evidence was overwhelming, the victims were sympathetic, and the pattern of behavior demonstrated clear intent and planning. Natasha finally accepted the plea deal on a Monday morning in late October, 3 months after I'd overheard that conversation in the hallway. I attended the plea hearing with Dennis and watched as Natasha stood before Judge Nakamura and admitted to multiple felony counts. Her voice was flat, emotionless, nothing like the woman I thought I'd known. Judge Nakamura accepted the plea and scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. As we left the courthouse, Dennis told me the hardest part was over. Now we just had to get through sentencing and then focus on financial recovery. The sentencing hearing was on a cold morning in early December. Richard Thornton attended, looking older than his 38 years. Alexander Yang came with his current wife. I attended with Leo and Dennis. We all sat together in the gallery, 3 men who'd been targeted by the same person, connected by a shared experience of manipulation and betrayal. Rebecca Cross called each of us to give victim impact statements. Richard went first, describing how Natasha had isolated him from friends and family, convinced him to open joint accounts, and then disappeared with $30,000 and his grandmother's jewelry. Alexander talked about the psychological damage of discovering that his entire marriage had been a calculated fraud, how it had affected his ability to trust people, how he still struggled with second-guessing his perceptions of reality. Then it was my turn. I stood at the podium and looked at Natasha sitting at the defense table. She stared straight ahead, not meeting my eyes. I talked about hearing her describe me as someone she'd settled for, how that had been the moment the mask slipped. I described the systematic draining of our accounts, the forged documents, the calculated manipulation. I explained how she'd shown up at my office and performed the role of victim so convincingly that my boss had almost believed her. I talked about the text messages where she and Vincent had discussed me like I was a mark rather than a person. When I finished, Judge Nakamura thanked me and asked if Natasha wanted to make a statement. Her attorney advised her not to, but Natasha stood anyway. She looked at each of us, Richard, Alexander, and me, and said, "I'm sorry for what I did. I made terrible choices and hurt people who didn't deserve it. I can't undo the damage, but I want you to know that I understand what I did was wrong." Her voice caught on the last words, and for a second I almost believed she meant it. But then I remembered those text messages, the cold calculations, the 6 years of practiced manipulation. This was just another performance, one last attempt to seem sympathetic for the judge. Judge Nakamura wasn't buying it either. He sentenced her to 7 years in state prison, full restitution to all victims, and permanent prohibition from any financial or fiduciary role after release. Vincent Thornton had already been sentenced to 5 years with 3 suspended due to his cooperation. As they led Natasha away, I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't known was there. It wasn't happiness exactly, more like closure. The nightmare was finally, definitively over. The financial recovery took longer. Renata and Diane worked with authorities to trace and recover as much of the stolen money as possible. They managed to retrieve about $78,000 from various accounts Natasha and Vincent had used, which was distributed among the 3 victims based on how much each had lost. I got back roughly $61,000 of the $127,000 she'd taken from me. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to rebuild. I moved out of Leo's apartment into a small place of my own, somewhere Natasha had never been, somewhere with no memories of her. I closed all joint accounts, changed all my passwords, locked down my credit. Dennis helped me establish better financial protections, separate accounts, better monitoring, safeguards against someone gaining access to my finances the way Natasha had. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Kenneth Ramos, who specialized in recovery from manipulative relationships. Dr. Ramos helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just a bad breakup. It was systematic psychological abuse designed to make me doubt my own perceptions and accept treatment I'd normally reject. The grateful narrative Natasha had established with her friends wasn't casual cruelty. It was grooming, preparing me to accept worse treatment by establishing that I was lucky to have her rather than the other way around. The sessions with Dr. Ramos were difficult, but necessary. He helped me identify the red flags I'd missed, how quickly Natasha had pushed for commitment, how she'd isolated me from friends who might have questioned our relationship, how she'd positioned herself as damaged and in need of gentle handling while simultaneously treating me with calculated contempt. He helped me understand that my trust wasn't stupidity. It was a normal human response to someone who was professionally skilled at manipulation. Natasha and Vincent had refined their approach over years and multiple victims. The fact that I'd fallen for it didn't mean I was naive or weak. It meant they were good at what they did. That reframing helped, though I still struggled with anger at myself for not seeing it sooner. Dr. Ramos reminded me that I had seen it eventually. I'd heard that conversation. I'd trusted my gut that something was wrong, and I'd taken action. I'd documented evidence, involved professionals, and pursued justice. Those were the actions of someone strong, not weak. 6 months after sentencing, I got a letter from Richard Thornton. He'd gotten my contact information through the Victim Services Coordinator and wanted to reach out. His letter was thoughtful and raw, describing his own recovery process and thanking me for pursuing the case against Natasha. He wrote, "For years I felt crazy. Everyone told me I was being paranoid about my ex-wife, that I was just bitter about the divorce. Seeing her convicted, seeing that there were other victims, validated everything I'd felt. You did that, Jeffrey. You didn't let her get away with it. You fought back with evidence and documentation and you won. That matters more than you probably realize." I wrote back, and we started corresponding occasionally. It was oddly comforting to talk with someone who understood exactly what it felt like to be targeted by Natasha's manipulation. Richard had moved on, remarried, rebuilt his life. His example gave me hope that I could do the same. Alexander Yang reached out around the same time, and the three of us formed this unlikely support network of men who'd survived the same predator. A year after the sentencing, Leo and I met for dinner at the cafe where I'd first talked with Dennis Kowalski. So much had changed in 12 months. I'd rebuilt my savings, established better financial protections, done a year of therapy, and started dating again. Cautiously, with clear boundaries and healthy skepticism, but dating nonetheless. Leo asked how I was doing, really doing, and I had to think about it. I was better than I'd been, but not entirely whole. There was still this tendency to second-guess my perceptions, to wonder if I was missing something obvious, to be hypervigilant about people's motives. Dr. Ramos said that was normal trauma response and would fade with time. Meanwhile, I'd learned to live with it, to use it as protective awareness rather than debilitating paranoia. I told Leo all of this, and he nodded thoughtfully. Then he said, "You know what I respect most about how you handled this? You could have just walked away when you realized what she was doing. You could have protected yourself and let her find the next victim. But you didn't. You built a case. You involved authorities. You made sure she faced consequences. That took courage." I hadn't thought of it that way, but he was right. The easy path would have been to leave quietly, to absorb my financial losses and move on. Instead, I'd chosen the harder path of documentation and prosecution. That choice had protected future victims, people who would have been targeted if Natasha and Vincent had continued their pattern. That mattered. I thought about Natasha sometimes, wondered if prison was changing her, or if she was just counting days until release and planning her next move. I thought about how convincing her apology had sounded at sentencing, and how I couldn't tell if any part of it was real. I thought about that conversation I'd overheard, her describing me as boring and stable and grateful, and how that had been the moment everything started unraveling. If that bathroom door had been fully closed, if I'd stayed at work that day, I might never have known. I might have married her. I might have ended up like Alexander Yang, discovering the truth only after years of marriage and exponentially more damage. Detective Whitmore called me about 18 months after sentencing. He wanted to update me that Natasha had been moved to a different facility after disciplinary issues. Apparently, she'd been running a prison commissary scheme, manipulating other inmates. I wasn't surprised. Manipulation was her core skill, the thing she was genuinely talented at. The context might change, romantic relationships, prison commissary, but the fundamental approach remained the same. Find vulnerable targets, establish control, extract resources, move on when exposed. The detective also told me that investigators in 2 other states were looking into similar patterns of fraud that might be connected to Natasha's network. It turned out Vincent Thornton had a cousin who'd been running comparable schemes in Arizona, and they were trying to determine if this was a larger operation than they'd originally thought. The news didn't change anything for me personally, but it reinforced how systematic and calculated the whole thing had been. This wasn't crime of passion or desperation. This was organized, methodical financial predation. I ran into Kimberly about 2 years after the sentencing. She was at a coffee shop near my apartment, and we made awkward eye contact across the room. I considered leaving, but something made me walk over instead. She looked uncomfortable, which seemed appropriate. I said hello and asked how she was doing. Kimberly stammered something about being fine, then said, "Jeffrey, I'm sorry. About what happened. About what Natasha said that day and how I didn't speak up." I appreciated the apology, but told her it wouldn't have mattered. Natasha's manipulation was sophisticated enough that even if Kimberly had warned me, I probably wouldn't have believed it until I'd seen evidence for myself. Kimberly nodded, then said something that surprised me. "I cut ties with her after you left that day. The way she talked about you, the casual cruelty, it made me realize she talked about everyone that way when they weren't around. I didn't want to be friends with someone like that." She'd testified at the trial, something I hadn't known. Kimberly had described Natasha's pattern of trash-talking partners and making them seem grateful for her attention. That testimony had helped establish the psychological manipulation pattern that was part of the prosecution's case. We talked for a few more minutes, and I found myself feeling grateful for the encounter. Kimberly's apology helped me understand that not everyone who'd been in Natasha's orbit was an accomplice. Some were just people who'd been charmed and manipulated like I had, who'd realized too late what they were seeing. We parted on good terms, and I walked home thinking about the ripple effects of Natasha's fraud. It wasn't just Richard, Alexander, and me who'd been affected. It was friends and family and colleagues who'd been lied to and used as props in her various schemes. The damage was wide and lasting, but the recovery was real too. I was whole in ways I hadn't been 2 years ago. I'd learned to trust my perceptions, to document concerns, to seek professional help when something felt wrong. I'd learned that being trusting wasn't weakness, but that being blindly trusting was dangerous. I'd learned the difference between healthy vulnerability and being a target. 3 years after the sentencing, I got a notification that Natasha was up for early parole. I wrote a letter to the parole board detailing my experience and respectfully requesting that they deny her release. Richard and Alexander wrote similar letters. Rebecca Cross, who was still with the DA's office, made a formal recommendation against parole, citing the sophisticated nature of the crimes and the lack of demonstrated rehabilitation. The parole board denied Natasha's request, determining that she needed to serve substantially more of her sentence before being considered for release. I felt relieved when I got the notification. Part of me had worried that Natasha's manipulation skills would work even on the parole board, that her performance of remorse would be convincing enough to win early release. But the documentation prevailed. The pattern of behavior was too clear, the history too established. She'd serve at least another 2 years before being eligible for another parole hearing. I'm writing this now, 4 years after overhearing that conversation in the hallway, sitting in my apartment that Natasha never saw, living a life she never touched. I've been dating someone for 8 months, a teacher named Olivia who's patient with my trust issues and doesn't push when I need space. We met through friends, took things slowly, had conversations about finances and boundaries and expectations early on. She thinks I'm overcautious sometimes, but she respects it. Dr. Ramos says I'm using healthy protective strategies rather than avoiding relationships out of fear, which feels like progress. I still have moments of doubt, times when I second-guess people's motives or worry I'm missing obvious red flags. But mostly, I'm okay. The anger has faded into something quieter, more like wisdom than rage. I know now that some people are professionals at deception, that trust has to be earned gradually rather than given freely, that documentation matters, and professional help exists for a reason. If you're reading this and something in your relationship feels off, trust that instinct. If your partner describes you in ways that make you feel small or grateful or replaceable, pay attention to that. If money is disappearing and explanations don't add up, document everything and get professional help immediately. Don't let someone make you feel crazy or oversensitive for having concerns. Don't accept being positioned as lucky to have them, rather than equal partners building something together. And if you discover you've been targeted by someone like Natasha, know that recovery is possible. It's hard, and it takes time, and there are scars that don't fully fade. But you can come out the other side stronger, wiser, and whole. I did. Richard and Alexander did. You can too. The truth wins eventually, if you're patient and thorough and willing to fight for it with evidence instead of just emotion. That bathroom door being open 6 inches changed my entire life. But what changed, it wasn't just overhearing cruel words. It was choosing to investigate instead of accepting gaslighting. It was documenting evidence instead of trusting reassurances. It was involving professionals instead of trying to handle it alone. It was pursuing justice instead of quietly absorbing the damage. Those choices made the difference between being another victim in Natasha's pattern and being the person who finally stopped her. I'll carry the scars of those 3 years for the rest of my life, but I'll also carry the knowledge that when it mattered most, I fought back smart instead of giving up. And that knowledge, more than any amount of recovered money, makes me someone she couldn't ultimately defeat. She took my savings and my trust and 3 years of my life. But she didn't take my ability to recognize truth, to demand justice, and to rebuild something better on my own terms. That's the part that matters most in the end. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.